amazed myself. I would never say this out loud, not because it wasn't true, but because once spoken it could never be taken back. Some truths change shape when they leave the heart. They stop being private burdens and become living things. They demand consequences. So I stayed silent for a long time. Silence felt like strength. It felt like control. It felt like dignity. I told myself that some feelings are meant to be carried, not shared. That restraint was maturity. That endurance was wisdom. But silence has a way of turning heavy when it's built on fear instead of peace. And tonight something inside me finally admitted what it had been protecting all along. I wasn't silent because I was strong. I was silent because I was afraid of what would change if I spoke. Afraid of being misunderstood. Afraid of being seen too clearly. Afraid that once I told the truth, I would no longer be able to pretend I didn't want what I wanted. There is a particular loneliness that comes from knowing your truth but never letting it breathe. You function, you smile, you show up, but something inside you stays unfinished. I told myself I didn't need to be chosen, that I was complete on my own, that longing was weakness. But longing doesn't disappear just because you refuse to name it. It waits quietly, patiently. I convinced myself that restraint made me noble, that wanting less meant being more evolved. But what I was really doing was negotiating with my own heart, asking it to be smaller so the world would remain comfortable, and the heart will try to comply for a while until one day it asks you a question you can't ignore. How long do you plan to abandon me? That question arrived without warning, not dramatically, not during a crisis, but in a moment of stillness. I realized I was tired not of people, not of effort, but of pretending that my silence was neutral. It wasn't. It was costing me intimacy with myself. There are things I have felt deeply but never allowed to surface because I didn't know where they would land. I didn't know who they would disrupt. I didn't know if I would still recognize myself afterward. So I stayed quiet. I mastered the art of appearing unbothered, of being fine, of redirecting conversations away from what mattered. I became very good at not asking for what I wanted. People praised my composure, They admired my calm. They called me grounded. They didn't see the quiet negotiations happening inside. How often I told myself, not now, not like this, not worth the risk. But tonight, something shifted. Not because circumstances changed, not because someone asked, but because I finally realized that my silence was no longer protecting me, it was erasing me. I promised myself I'd never say this because I thought saying it would make me vulnerable. What I didn't realize was that not saying it had already done that. There is a difference between privacy and suppression, between peace and avoidance. And I crossed that line without noticing. This isn't a confession meant to be dramatic. It's not an announcement. It's an acknowledgement that I have wanted, that I have hoped, that I have imagined a life that required courage instead of compliance, and that I am done pretending those desires don't exist. I don't know what happens next. I don't know who this truth will change or what it will ask of me. But I know this. Silence is no longer an option I can afford because the cost has become greater than the risk. And for the first time, I am choosing honesty, not because it is easy, but because it is necessary. I used to tell myself that silence was neutral, that by not speaking, I was choosing peace. But silence is never empty. It is always holding something. What I didn't admit, what I barely allowed myself to think, was that my silence wasn't about calm. It was about protection, not protection from others, protection from myself. Because once a truth is spoken, it becomes undeniable. And denial was the last place I still felt safe. There are feelings that don't ask permission. They arrive quietly, settle slowly, and before you realize it, they have rearranged the inner furniture of your life. Mine did that. I didn't fall suddenly. I didn't lose control. I didn't betray anyone. I simply noticed how certain moments stayed with me longer than they should have, noticed how certain absences felt louder than others, noticed how my thoughts returned to the same place when I was tired, unguarded, or honest. So I stayed silent because naming it would mean admitting that I cared in a way that couldn't be casual, that something mattered more than I was ready to handle. Silence gave me room to pretend it was harmless. I told I myself it was admiration, curiosity, respect, anything but what it truly was, because acknowledging the truth would have meant facing questions I didn't want to answer. What do you do when your heart leans towards something that doesn't come with guarantees? What do you do when wanting feels risky, inappropriate, or inconvenient? You learn to swallow it. You learn to reframe it as discipline. You learn to call it maturity, and the world applauds you for it. No one criticizes the person who stays composed. No one questions the one who doesn't ask for more. They call you strong. They don't see the quiet cost. I wasn't afraid of rejection. I was afraid of clarity, because clarity would force me to decide to move closer or to walk away completely. And as long as I stayed silent, I could exist in the in between. Hope without expectation, feeling without accountability. Silence allowed me to linger, but lingering is exhausting. It drains you slowly, because you are always half present, never fully honest, never fully detached. I protected I myself from disappointment by never asking, from loss by never claiming, from exposure by never admitting. But protection can turn into confinement. Without warning, I began to notice how careful I had become, not just with words, but with myself. How I filtered my reactions, how I measured my tone, how I edited my thoughts before they even reached my mouth. I wasn't being considerate. I was being afraid of my own depth. The truth is, I didn't trust that my feelings were allowed to exist without causing damage. I didn't trust that wanting something deeply could be held with integrity. So I chose restraint, and restraint became my identity. But something about that began to feel dishonest, not to others, to me, because the silence was no longer peaceful. It was heavy. It was tight. It required constant maintenance. And the more I carried it, the more I realized that the thing I was protecting myself from was not rejection or judgment. It was responsibility. Responsibility to honor what I felt. Responsibility to act in alignment with my truth. Responsibility to accept whatever outcome followed. Honesty, silence, delayed that reckoning, but it couldn't prevent it. That's why I'm here now, saying what I once promised I never would. Not because the fear disappeared, but because living without honesty became more frightening than speaking with consequences. This isn't about confession for relief. It's about reclamation of my voice, of my right to feel, of my permission to be honest, even if it changes things, especially if it changes things. I used to believe that if a truth mattered, it would demand action, that if something was real enough, it would force a decision. But some truths don't come to disrupt lives. They come to restore honesty. This one has always known who it was for, not in a dramatic way, not as a declaration, more like a quiet recognition, the kind that doesn't announce itself but settles in gently and refuses to leave. I noticed it in the pauses, in the way certain words stayed with me longer than others, in the way silence felt different depending on who shared it, in the way my guard lowered without effort, without strategy. It wasn't obsession, it wasn't fantasy, it was familiarity without history. And that confused me more than anything, because how do you explain feeling understood without having explained yourself? How do you justify comfort that didn't need to be built? So I didn't. I told myself it was coincidence, timing, projection. I gave it every name except the honest one, because honesty would have meant admitting that my heart had already chosen where it felt most awake, even if nothing had been promised, even if nothing could be claimed. This truth was never about possession. It was about recognition, about seeing someone and realizing that something in you responds without being invited. I didn't speak because I didn't want to burden anyone with expectations they never asked for. I didn't want to turn something pure into something heavy. I thought silence was respect, but silence also withholds clarity, and clarity doesn't always demand action. It sometimes just asks to be acknowledged. What I've learned is that speaking a truth doesn't mean you are asking for something. It doesn't mean you are crossing a line. It doesn't mean you are demanding a response. Sometimes it simply means you are refusing to lie anymore. I don't know if this truth will ever be shared